Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. We're both lifelong hunters, deer biologists, professors of wildlife management, and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. We explain the latest research, including our own work and that conducted elsewhere.
So if you're interested in deer biology and management, this is your podcast. Every decision you make is a step in your management program, and we give you the knowledge to make every decision count. Welcome back to the Deer University podcast. And Steve, good to see you again. Now that you are no longer in Starkville, but you have moved west, so I don't see you as commonly as I used to, so good to see you.
Thank you. It's great to see you, Bronson.
Well, what we wanted to do today, Steve, is we made an announcement in our last episode about your retirement transition you're going through and spending more time with family in Texas, and that's wonderful. So what we wanted to do now is talk about the person that is replacing you, and then we're also going to talk about my retirement transition I'm going through, and talk about the person that's going to replace me. So why don't I pass it on to you, and you can talk about Eric.
Oh, sure. Eric Michel, great guy. He came on he was kind of a wrap up kind of student on a long-term project years ago. He was the third pair of graduate students on the big environment and genetics project that we had. And then he stayed, that was his master's, and he stayed on to kind of wrap together this cumulative 10-year project that was kind of integrating everything from the 6 former master's students and then put that all together in a PhD project. And wow, Eric did a great job on both. And well, then he left, which all good students do, and they get a job. And you went to South Dakota, had some great experiences there. And well, this is just a real summary. I'm going to let him talk details, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, gee, you had some big personal things happen in South Dakota, and then you went to Minnesota and worked for a state agency. Still in research with a state agency perspective, and we've been so applied. That's our thing with the MSU Deer Lab is we do applied research, and so you being able to work in a state agency's perspective on research, and then come back here and be able to lead the research portion of this partnership that research, education, and adult education and outreach, this great combination that Bronson and I have had. I think it's a great thing. Eric, welcome to Mississippi State University. Welcome back.
Thanks, Doc. Yeah, it's great to be back. Like you said, Steve, I first showed up in Starkville January of 2010. I graduated from UW Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and moved down 10 days later and started my master's. And all of my work here was out at our captive facility. My master's really revolved around looking at behavior of the does out at the pens, and whether dominance ranking had any influence on fawn production, body mass of fawns, things like that. And then wrapping up my PhD with the Environment and Genetics project, looking at really the impact of nutrition on antler and body size for deer out at the pens, and how that varied from region to region. So we had deer from 3 different regions brought back to the facility. We kept them all separate by region. Harvest data showed that there was variation in antler and body size from deer harvested from each respective region. We fed all those deer the same nutrition and allowed them to breed within their region of origin, and found that once you eliminate the nutritional differentiation that we saw in the wild, antler size caught up, and deer from the lowest quality soil region had the same antler size as deer from the highest quality soil region. Body size lagged a little bit, but there was still compensation in that realm as well. So I finished my PhD in 2016 and moved north to South Dakota State University, where I worked with Dr. John Jenks and Dr. Bill Jensen. Bill was actually out of North Dakota Game and Fish, and it was a collaborative relationship there with those two. They had data from the past 25 years from various fawn survival studies and movement studies, and really their goal is to bring me on and kind of wrap it all together. And that's what I did. I got a handful of publications using those data, and we're actually in the process of now writing a book on deer ecology from the northern Great Plains. So we've got that submitted to the publisher, and we're waiting back for edits on that as well. From there, I jumped across the border into Minnesota, where I worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. And they've got a unique situation there within their state agency. They actually have a research branch within their agency. So I was a research scientist for them. I oversaw our deer and elk research in the farmland region, which is actually a fairly large part of the state in Minnesota. I also got to help set regulations for harvest every single year. So I ran our population model and made initial recommendations on how many tags we could allocate. Minnesota is a little bit different than Mississippi. There's certainly parts of Minnesota where you don't have a very high deer density, so you're only allocating one tag to each hunter in that part of the state. And there's even some parts of the states where it's bucks only. You can only shoot a buck. So it's a little bit different management. I got to work with our big game program a lot to develop research. Tried to work with our area managers as well. And there's different interests there. Our big game program, they dealt a lot with the regulations. So some of the stuff that we talked about differed with the big game program compared to our area managers, where they were a little bit more concerned about habitat. So everything I tried to do was tying back into one of those two realms. Then this opportunity came open, and was able to take advantage of it, and back in Starkville. So it feels good to be back.
Fantastic. Well, you kind of really quickly covered that PhD wrap up of the environment and genetics. To me, we made some really monumental findings there. And one of the terms I think you came up with was that generational improvement in nutrition. The need for not just putting some food out for a year, but long-term improvement in nutritional intake over generations of deer. And to me, that's so critical to help landowners and hunters understand there is no quick fix. There is no magic bullet in the world of deer habitat improvements. And if you're not able to manage habitat, put feed out, a lot of people do that. But don't think you're going to fix something in a year. It's generational. It doesn't matter how you fix the nutrition, but it's a generational input. Were you able to take that knowledge and apply it, as you move more north?
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you made, and I did go through that quickly. And one of the things that I think we really were able to take away from that PhD is, just like you said, that generational improvement. You can implement habitat management or provide improved quality nutrition immediately and see impacts on individuals. But if you want to take your average antler size and body weights and improve them, it's going to take generations of improvements to do that. And we found it was about 2 generations. It's actually funny, when I was at South Dakota State University, I was teaching a little bit up there too, and I made it a point, whether it was the mammalogy class I taught or the intro to fisheries and wildlife management, I made a lecture to discuss the impacts of genetics and nutrition on antler and body size, because that is everything that I hear, regardless of where I'm at in the country, is we have great nutrition here, we got great genetics, and that's why we're seeing these 3.5-year-olds hit 150. And so I was able to really take my PhD and educate about the limitations of trying to manipulate genetic structure in the wild versus improve nutrition. And got a lot of questions, had a lot of conversations with students about that.
Great. Speaking of nutritional improvements, Bronson, do you remember, whenever Eric would go back up to Wisconsin at like Christmas or something, he'd always bring back nutritional supplements. And so he'd
I,
pass out these bags of cheese curds,
I remember quite well. Yeah.
that little squeaky, chewy cheese thing that is so popular and good.
Yeah, it took some getting used to. I was a little indifferent. Well, first of all, I didn't know what in the world it was. But after I gave it a try, I love cheese. So I can see where people would really, really like that. So, yeah. Well, another thing that's kind of unique, Eric, with your path, what's great with research is when you do a study, and as replicated. It was a 10-year study here and large sample size, et cetera. So we thought what we found was real, and it is. But what was really good is then you go to an institution where they had done some similar research 5 to 10 years before that. So you saw that similar epigenetic, or that was the conclusion, was that it was an epigenetic effect. And they had kind of a similar situation in South Dakota. And you can remind me, but they had a region where generally habitat quality in terms of nutrition is better, and a region where it's poor, which was very similar to our situation here in Mississippi. And they found a similar result.
Yeah, their situation in South Dakota, the eastern part of the state's highly agricultural. So a lot of soybeans, a lot of corn, subsequently larger antler body sizes from the eastern part of the state. But then you have the Black Hills region of South Dakota, where historically they had smaller antler sizes and lower body weights. So they did something similar. I believe that they bottle raised their animals, but they found similar responses. It wasn't quite as strong as what we found because we were able to control and we had larger sample sizes like we talked about, but similar responses. I mean, once you remove those nutritional limitations, you see increases in antler and body size. And then we were able to take that one step further and increase the sample size and really observe the full effect of it.
One of the cool things, Bronson, I think, with moving forward in the future for the Deer Lab and the podcast, the Deer University podcast in particular, is we have a large audience up north. And a lot of listeners, we get questions, and comments back, well, does this research apply up here? And we can talk, well, how we understand, what we know about blah, blah, blah. And here's Eric, who grew up there. It's had a family dairy farm, knows about hard work and the impact of the environment on domestic livestock, and now he's greatly schooled in wildlife and deer. And so now, Eric, you can not just say, well, from how we understand it, you can say, here's what I know from Wisconsin, Minnesota, South Dakota. You've collectively greatly increased the breadth of coverage of background knowledge for the Deer Lab. So glad you came
Yeah,
back.
yeah, I'm happy and excited to be back, but I'm happy that I had the opportunities to go back north and study whitetails up there and totally different parts of the country from where I grew up too. I mean, out on the plains in South Dakota, it's very different in South Dakota compared to southwestern Wisconsin. And then in the farmland region of Minnesota, it's more similar to South Dakota. But with me running the population model for the entire state in Minnesota, I got to do research across the state. So I wasn't as limited as some of the other scientists in the group. So that was really cool as well. I mean, I got to go to far northeastern Minnesota in almost a boreal type of landscape and observe white-tailed deer there as well. So, and I still actually have a student who's finishing up some work in northeastern Minnesota right now. So lots of cool experiences. Glad to be back and bring it all together.
So, Eric, if you could generalize, so kind of what Steve was referring to there, even though the landscape is different, we all have the same principles in managing a deer herd. And you were able to determine up there, or excuse me, the researchers in South Dakota, able to demonstrate that there's not a genetics problem. The genetics are there. It just needs to be unlocked with nutrition. But a very general question here with Mississippi, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Minnesota, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking in the South, the problems that we have are too many deer density, the subsequent effects of that on nutrition or lack of habitat management, and that kind of suppressing deer phenotypes, not being as big as they could be. Can you generalize when you get to South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin? What is kind of always the entry level problem up there? Maybe it's not density, maybe it's age structure, maybe it's habitat, but what are the first things you look for in that environment?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really comes back to the objectives, right? And in Mississippi, I think objectives from hunters are different from those other states, and that we emphasize a lot of times here the age structure for larger antlers and body sizes, mature animals, things like that. Up north, it's different because you can grow pretty big deer at 3.5 or even at 2.5. I mean, there can be some, that 110 inch antler size at 2.5 years of age, and that's just what's up there. So I think informing people about age structure and that being the easiest thing that you can do to try to increase antler and body size. It's something that uh, obviously we all talk about, but laying off the trigger and getting people to actually age deer on the hoof and educate them what they're looking for to increase that age structure and getting everybody on the same page. That's another big part of it too. I think the second part that really, when I was in Minnesota, this really kind of came to light as being the top priority that we had was density. And that's, that's a pretty common theme across the deers, the whitetails range. But in Minnesota, South Dakota, it's a little bit different in that you have such fragmented habitat that you have these really super high deer densities on a very local scale, but you don't manage at the local scale, you manage on a much larger scale. So how do you manage for high deer densities at a very small scale when overall there's just not the habitat for them? But in Minnesota, in the central part of the state, you have a mix that's almost 50% egg, 50% forested. And so you have these really high deer densities that we just couldn't control. We could control deer densities in the more fragmented landscapes if we really wanted to. We just gave out more antlerless tags and allowed hunters to go out and do what they would do. But then we had the exact opposite problem in northeastern Minnesota where we had really few deer. We didn't have high deer densities, and we had these declining populations that just kept on declining no matter what we did. And a lot of that was related to weather and winter severity, and we just didn't have obviously any control over what was going on in the wintertime. So bringing that back to habitat management, trying to figure out what was limiting for those deer, whether it's recruitment, survival, what was actually driving those decreases. So really at the end of the day, everything started out with density and then trying to educate our hunters that in Minnesota, our average age of harvest was 2.5. It wasn't a yearling, that we're trying to move the needle a little bit there, things like that. I mean, it all kind of ties together, but those were the common themes that I saw.
And
Gotcha.
and that density managing issue, Eric, in the South, across the South, the state agencies have learned that, they've tried to manage the harvest by first lengthening the seasons and then increasing bag limits and then liberalizing use of weapons. You can just about shoot a modern firearm even, during primitive weapon seasons in some states under DMAP restrictions and control and things. So, but the problem is the average number of deer harvested by successful deer hunters over my 27-year career in Mississippi never changed from 1.5 deer.
Yeah.
You just can't get the average hunter to shoot harvest the number of deer needed to control density. Is that an issue in the North? If you increase tags, because we didn't have tags in Mississippi, it was just a bag limit. But if you increase the tags, could you actually harvest more deer?
No, we had the exact same issue. I think it was 1.7 deer per hunter is what the numbers came out to. And we had really great data because in Minnesota, you have to register your animal. So we had a pretty good idea, not that it's perfect, but we had a pretty good idea of how many hunters were killing and how many deer each hunter was killing. And a perfect example, when chronic wasting disease was found in the southeastern part of Minnesota, they went to an unlimited tag structure where you just keep harvesting. And we actually found that beyond the number of people that were actually harvesting 5 deer was well under 5%. So you start getting into some of the human dynamics of people thinking, we're devaluing deer because you have unlimited tags. Why are we having any restrictions? We're not able to meet any objectives other than reducing deer density. So we actually backed it off to a 5 deer limit, knowing that that's covering most everybody. Most people aren't even harvesting 2 or 3 deer, and that never changed the needle, that 1.5 or 1.7 or whatever it was deer per hunter. So it's the same thing. South Dakota is a little bit different because you're dealing overall with just lower deer densities. It was just a little bit different from Minnesota, and Minnesota is such a diverse state that there were areas that had highly overpopulated deer populations. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty universal, it seems like.
So I guess there's like a deer hunter eating carrying capacity of 1.5 to 2 deer. Just can't get any more than that.
I think a lot of it comes down to freezer space and willingness to take the time to actually skin a deer, process a deer, the money it takes to take it to a processor, or even the time it takes if you're going to process it on your own. all those things I think come into play. And it's just, I mean, we have 3 little kids, and to get a couple hours even in the evening to go cut on a deer, that's starting to dwindle into other time for kids, family, wife, all those things. And we're all busy as is. So I think that really has a big part to play in it all. And I'm saying that, and coming from somebody who, if all I could eat is white-tailed deer and venison throughout the year, I mean, I would stack my freezer full if I had unlimited resources. And that's what I did in grad school. I didn't hunt that much. I did get work done. Let's say my postdoc, when I was in South Dakota, I shot a lot of deer. I'll put it that way. But still, it just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time to fill the freezer.
Hey, Eric, one thing I remember from South Dakota, you don't have to go into great detail unless you want to. Your pesticide research, y'all had a real big publication looking at, you'll have to remind me what the pesticide was or the chemical in it. But could you tell people about that real quick, just some basic findings?
Yeah, so there was a master student at SDSU when I was there, and she was looking at the influence of neonicotinoids on white-tailed deer morphology, survival. Basically, neonics are the most widely used pesticide on the market. They're used in something like 500 registered products. So everything from big agriculture down to home use. I mean, they're all over the place. And they're starting to they're marketed in that they're supposed to be more targeted for insects and not as influential on non-target species. And that's when you start talking about like these colony collapses for honeybees and things like that. These pesticides are starting to impact them. Neonics are all in that category. So they started to kind of come into the front, into the spotlight there. And then research started finding that they're impacting other non-target species like birds and other species that eat bugs. So we wanted to look at, or they were looking at how they impacted fawns and white-tailed deer adults. And they were actually at a controlled study. So at SDSU is another unique situation where they had a capped facility just like we had here at Mississippi State. And they were controlling the levels of neonics in the drinking water of deer. And so they had a control group where they weren't exposing them to any neonics. They had low, medium, high treatment groups. And then they were just looking at morphology. They were looking at behavior, so feeding behavior, through observational studies. Looking at survival of the fawns, just how many fawns were dying throughout the year. And then actually at the end of the study, we euthanized all the animals so we could obtain the spleens and the brains, the kidneys and livers and measure neonic levels in all the deer that were in the study. And the first big surprise was even the control group was exposed to neonics. So throughout either runoff because there's a huge cornfield right next to the capped facility there at SDSU, either water runoff or uptake of neonics through other vegetation that was growing in the pens or whatever it was, we had exposure for all treatment groups. That was the big finding, the first big finding. The second big finding was, really the thing that kind of gets cited the most is that we saw decreased survival for fawns once we saw a neonic level of, I think, 0.3 nanograms per gram. Once we got above that, we had decreased survival for those fawns. So we were able to demonstrate in a controlled setting that these pesticides, were having negative impacts on species like white-tailed deer. And that some of that work carried over to Minnesota. When I started there, we started working with the Wildlife Health Program. We were working with neonics, and we weren't able to document specific impacts. We were documenting more of just prevalence of neonic exposure across the state, and we were finding it was just crazy. We were detecting neonics in places like northeastern Minnesota where there's no agriculture whatsoever. So again, like I said, there's 500 different products that neonics are used in. So it's coming from somewhere, whether it's forestry, home use, since being runoff or whatever it is. It's prevalent in the environment, and we just don't know what the impacts are in the wild.
Can you name a couple of popular products because the average listener probably doesn't know what go to the store. Oh yeah, I think of neonics is this.
Yeah, well, sure. So, and I'm blanking on specific products, but there's several different pesticides within the neonic category. So we usually looked at clethodim and imidacloprid were the two big ones that we looked at. A really common example is when you go buy bell peppers or whatever you might be buying for your garden, a lot of those seeds are treated with neonics. They have neonic treated seeds, and that's what you're growing in your garden. So I mean, it's everywhere. If you think about just like tick treatment for your dogs or anything like that, there's a chance that neonics could be within those products. But yeah, I mean, it's prevalent.
So in general, it wasn't that there was exposure. It was the extent of the exposure. So
Exactly.
in other words, a single event probably is not a big deal, but it would be a lifetime of heavy exposure could have effects.
Yeah, and that's kind of where our research in Minnesota left off. Was we were trying to figure out, or we were trying to better assess and understand how we could repeatedly measure exposure in the wild population. The South Dakota study, we correlated concentration within spleens to decrease survival, and spleens are important because of their role in health, basically in your immune system and function of your immune system. So that kind of made sense. But you can't go out and sample one deer multiple times if you remove the spleen from a deer, right? So we kind of left that research where we were trying to identify things that we could sample antemortem while the animal's still alive. So like urine, blood, feces, whatever it may be, to try to document chronic exposure across time, because you need that documentation before you can better understand how presence of neonics might be impacting behavior, survival, things like that in a free range population.
Gotcha.
One of the cool things, or it's unfortunate things about residue from a variety of things that are used in agriculture is runoff and back in the 1930s, I think it was that DDT was developed and was seen as the savior for, and it was critically helpful in the World War II to protect soldiers from malaria in various countries that they were fighting in. But then, it spread worldwide and was identified. That was the classic pesticide that Rachel Carson wrote about in her book in the 1960s that kind of started the efforts to control unregulated use of chemicals. And even though it's been outlawed in the United States for over 50 years, there's still residues of DDT, and which turns into DDE, but it impacts shell thickness in birds. But it's been shown to be present in the Arctic and Antarctic, where there is no spraying of DDT for insect control. But it's still used in non-developed countries. Most of the developed countries forbid it, but it's being used elsewhere, and it just goes all through our systems. Our world is greatly connected, much
Yeah.
more than we'd like to think that it is.
Well, Steve, the other part about research, you can do all the research you want to do, but if you don't get that information out there and people can't use it, learn from it, help them manage their deer, then the research is certainly not as useful. And so that's where you and I working together for so many years. That was we worked together on the research. We collaborated on that, but it was more or less my job then to take that research and to get it out in forums like Deer University and stuff
Mhm.
like that. And so I also am going to be retiring. I'm at a part-time workload right now, and that's going to change towards the end of the year, and I'll be probably totally removed from MSU and academia. So we have gone ahead and also hired my replacement, and that is Dr. Jacob Dykes. And Jacob, if you remember, also was an undergrad here at MSU, and then got his master's here as well, working with us as well as Marcus Lashley, and did a lot of food plot research. So did some really cool cafeteria style experiments. So we weren't specifically with that project looking at the forage, but what are the constituents of the forage that deer were changing and responding to throughout the year. And so Jacob then graduated here from MSU and went to Texas A&M Kingsville and worked down there. And I'll let Jacob talk about his project. But Jacob, welcome aboard. Thank you for kicking me out of my office. It's kind of weird looking at the background, knowing that was my office for about 20 years. So that's a little bit different. But we are delighted to have you in place here. So grateful that we have someone with your interest and your skill set that is really dedicated to the outreach portion of research. And so thanks, welcome. And why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you did for your PhD?
Yeah, thanks, Bronson. Thrilled to be here. I've been hiding in the corner for the first 30 minutes of this, listening to some of the fascinating stuff that Eric's done. And Eric and I overlapped for a year or two. I think, was that my undergrad or no, that would have been working on my master's here, actually.
Yeah, right as you started your master's.
Yeah, that's what it was. Back 15, I think. But yeah, so I'm from an hour north of here. So I did my undergrad here, ended up doing the master's. And just a little bit more about that, I thought it was pretty fascinating that we use the plants as the vehicle to deliver the different compositions of nutrients, if you will, and then monitored how deer changed their behavior to actually pursue certain nutrients or avoid certain nutrients. Ended up wrapping that up in 2018, moved to Kingsville, Texas, and worked at the Cesar Kleber Wildlife Research Institute. And if you've ever been to South Texas, then it is an excellent place to study the effects of heat. And so we were looking at how deer and cattle behaved during summer periods when it was extremely hot. Were they competing for resources, shade resources, things like that? So really, really fascinating stuff. Lots of GPS collars out, monitoring movement, things like that, and resource use. And one of the big takeaways from that is we saw that they were using the same resources, but they were using those resources at different times. So there was a temporal separation there. Did some other stuff while I was in Texas as well. We did some captive work where we manipulated the quality of shade in the deer facility, and then monitored where deer chose to spend their time as ambient temperature increased. And again, I know all of y'all have been to South Texas, and it's hot, right? It's hot. And,
It's hot.
it is hot. That's another reason I'm glad to be back to Mississippi. It gets hot here too, but I think when I moved in February, we were already in the 90s in South Texas. So a little bit longer of the cooler weather here, at least. But anyways, yeah, some of that captive stuff, one big takeaway that we found is deer didn't really care about the quality of shade until ambient temperature got to about 85 degrees. And then they were changing their behavior to seek out that higher quality shade. Every single trial that we ran. So some fascinating stuff there.
Jacob, is it just the shade, or is it the interaction of shade and wind?
Well, we did not control for wind. So each area we manipulated the shade quality, but the same amount of wind. You know what I mean? And so that 85 degrees, I would imagine, the climate in which we act it's not just ambient temperature, right? It's the effects of the sun. There comes the shade quality aspect of it, and then also the convective cooling of the wind as well. So I would imagine that, say, if you've got a really windy day, you're getting more of that convective cooling, that maybe that 85 degrees, it could go up a little bit, and on those really stale days where you don't get some of that convective cooling, that temperature may drop. But yeah, there's that whole interaction of everything that dictates how we feel,
Yeah, I guess, one thing for people that have never been down there, and Steve, you lived there for a while. I lived there for 3 years or so, give or take. The wind, it's compared to Mississippi anyway. It's always have a breeze. It's just how severe. Is it a breeze or is it the wind blowing? And that was something I remember that took me back, was when I got down there. I think it was in August, and the first reaction was, my gosh, it is really, really, really hot down here in August. And the second thing was, growing up in the Southeast, when it gets really hot, we're used to short sleeves or no shirt or, shorts, any way we can get clothes off our body to cool our body down. But it was just the opposite for guys working on the ranch and cowboys, etc. It was the long sleeves, long pants. And I just remember the very first guy I talked to about that. I'm like, I'm here in a t-shirt and shorts, and I'm I'm burning up. And he's in blue jeans and a denim shirt and a cowboy hat. But the assumption is, of course, you're going to start sweating with, at 105 or 107 or 110 degrees. But you're, of course, going to start sweating. And then you want your clothing to absorb that. And then you always have that wind blowing on your clothes to cool you down. So that's, I guess, that convective cooling like you're talking about, Jacob. But I guess I've never really thought about that as much here, Jacob. But when you started doing that research and looking at kind of the quality of cover, and so it's not just shade, but it's where deer were going and cattle were going. You needed to have shade, but you also needed to have a cover type that was not suppressing the wind moving through it as well. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was probably one of the biggest takeaways with a lot of that research too, is that it's more complex than you would think. I grew up thinking that, okay, if it's hot, I'm going to go stand in the shade. Well, in some cases that works, but I did a lot of work in South Texas where you'd get up in those thickets of brush, mott's or what we call them, and you're out of the sun, but it is like a sauna in there. Like there's no wind getting through. There's just this stale, and then even the heat that you're dissipating is just adding to that oven type environment, right? So, that kind of what came into play here was that we realized that one, not all shade is created equal. That was kind of the big takeaway, right? Just because you get out of the sun doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find refuge. That was the whole idea, right? Thermal refuge is what these critters are looking for, and it's not something that we think about a lot, but if you think about the most energetically taxing thing that any warm-blooded animal, if you will, has to do, that's regulate that internal body temperature. We don't think much about it, but our body is constantly fighting to keep that internal body temperature where it should be. And then when you start getting environmental factors like intense sun or intense ambient temperature, things like that, it is trying to move that internal temperature away from where it needs to be. So your body's got to respond, right? So we start sweating. Of course, we know whitetail don't have the ability to sweat. Most mammals don't. But we start sweating. We start breathing a little harder. Our blood vessels are dilating to dissipate heat. All sorts of interesting things. But those physiological responses are much, much more taxing energetically than just changing our behavior, right? So for us, we can huff and puff out there. We can sweat and turn red and all that good stuff, or we could just go get an AC, right? That behavioral change is much simpler. It costs a lot less to do that. Animals, of course, don't have that luxury, so they got to make decisions.
Yeah. One thing that at least I personally think is very interesting, over the years we give, rightfully so, Eric alluded to this earlier, we talk about winter severity up north, and that's a big deal. That can be a population driver. But we don't really think about the more chronic effects of heat and heat load on large mammals or herbivores in the South. And so I guess I'm trying to help our listeners a little bit. You may hear what Jacob is talking about and say, well, whoop-de-doo. So what? So they get a little hotter, or they find some places to bed to maybe cool them down. Well, that is a big deal because, and Steve, this gets back to some of our research looking at DMAP data and looking at summertime environmental conditions, is you can potentially have a short-term and a longer-term lag effect with that, is when deer get too hot, they forego eating. Mm-hmm. So they're not going to forage as long. Jacob, some of the research we've talked about from South Texas as well, is it may even dictate what types of food they eat in terms of the protein content, because different types of food are internally going to generate more heat or less heat. And so, when we start focusing on this, we don't think it's a big deal in the South, but it could end up being a very, very big deal, because Steve, as we've always talked about, how sensitive summertime is. That's the time of year bucks are growing antlers, does are gestating, lactating, etc. And so now we might have them making choices about the amount of time they forage the types of forages they choose to eat based on the heat load of their body. So I'm very excited to see where this type of research goes in this environment. That's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, and one thing that I when I work with hunters, a lot of people are putting a lot of time and energy into growing healthy deer herds, into growing larger antlers, and that kind of thing. Well, it's easy to say, well, we need to do this or we need to do that, habitat management wise, but we also need to understand exactly what's going on when we do manipulate the habitat, right? And that's where this comes in when you start thinking about thermal refuge. Yeah, if we're putting all this money and effort into growing bigger antlers or healthier deer, whatever it may be, then I do think that the temperature component to it, that stress is absolutely important. And especially, you just brought it up, the hottest time of the year, late gestation, lactation, and then boom, these does are hit with this, incredibly high temperature in a lot of parts of the country. And so, yeah, it's got to be just one more stressor to add to the situation, right?
Steve, if you remember, and this is all your fault, what I'm about to say.
Sure.
We did we did a pretty deep dive with our DMAP data, MDWFMP's DMAP data, and we went into that working with MDWFMP biologists because over the course that was 2014, 15, 16, something like that, and we had just had several droughts. And I know our Texas colleagues, a drought relative to Mississippi, not relative to South Texas, but relative to Mississippi, what are going to be the effects on deer body weights in the fall? So we wanted to make sure that there's not a misinterpretation of body weights are down. It must be a density dependent response, and recommend a doe harvest or a greater deer harvest, thinking that density is responsible for that change in body weight. So we were trying to disentangle what part of it is density, what part of it could be the environment. And so we went into it with our pet hypothesis in mind of it's got to be drought. It is, yeah, it's got to be drought. That is so intense, so intuitive. It's going to have the effects on plant quality, plant abundance. But in our modeling, and let me say this could change. We're doing another dive into it now. And so we're looking at it, adding some data. The story may change. So always got to be open to that with more data. But what we saw with the data that we had was that deer were far more sensitive to heat than they were the drought. Now, oftentimes over the course of a summer, those are correlated. But there's also some situations where you may have heat and rainfall versus just having heat and lack of rainfall. And so what our modeling showed was that what was consistently the stronger signal was what Jacob's referring to, and it was that prolonged high heat was having an effect on body weight. And then we dug into animal science and the livestock literature and so forth. And sure enough, there was an effect with heat load, foraging time, and things like that when they're dealing with these extreme temperatures. So very excited to see where this goes.
Yeah. And we've done some work with heat stress in the pens, late teens, and found similar behavioral responses of deer relative to the temperature of the day. And it comes down to heat, but that doesn't mean it's not drought. Drought was still a factor. It was just not the most significant factor. We don't want to say that drought doesn't matter. I don't want people thinking, oh, well, they're idiots. It definitely matters if it's drought.
Right.
It's relative, which surprised us. We was calling it our drought paper until it was, it's not drought. It's the not drought paper.
Yeah. There's more to the story than just drought. Yeah. It's the
That's
interaction.
the neat thing about doing research is you think you have an hypothesis that you want to prove or disprove, and then the muddy water comes in. And and this is got a tangent here, but I want to point out something that I'm excited about Jacob coming back for a lot of reasons. But if there was a sister university in the United States where you could learn about applied research as well as Mississippi State in the deer world, it is Texas A&M Kingsville. They have applied with all caps research. And so it's great having him go there for his doctoral research. And then you didn't mention about your extension work. How about that component relative to the position you're taking here?
Yeah. So, when I did my master's working with Bronson, that was like my first dose of extension. And I knew from then on that's what I wanted to do for my career. I love it. To me, the way that I explain it to people, because a lot of people don't necessarily know what extension is to me, it's the rest of the story, right? We do cool research, we answer important questions, and we'll publish that in a peer-reviewed journal. But sometimes it stops right there, right? And we jump on to the next project. But the goal with extension is to keep that information moving and make sure that it gets into the hands of the landowners, the managers, the hunters, that kind of thing. So it's the rest of the story, the full circle, right? Making sure we get that information out that's going to allow landowners to improve the way that they're managing wildlife and habitat on their properties, right? So that was my first dose of extension. When I finished up at Texas A&M University of Kingsville in 2022, I was then hired on at Texas A&M University in College Station. And I had the same title there, actually, doing the same thing, assistant professor and extension wildlife specialist. So again, doing lots of research, and then the rest of my time was spent traveling the state, working with landowners, talking with hunters, that kind of thing, making sure that they had the best science-based information that they could have to, again, improve wildlife and habitat management on their properties and accomplish their goals, right? So extension. That's the same thing we're going to be doing here. We're ramping up, getting some really cool research going, and we're going to be making sure that we get that information out.
So, Jacob, when you were an extension specialist there, did you ever give a presentation on basal area and a massapere in the brush country down there?
No, not so much. No, not so much. And Steve said this, but I really appreciate also that I got to go down in South Texas. It's a completely different landscape. And I can't say enough good things about those people. I worked under Dr. Randy DeYoung. I worked with Pancho Ortega and Dave Hewitt and just all of those people down there doing amazing work. So I got to learn some truly brilliant people, mentors, and but it's a different world down there. Here the landscape is driven by disturbance because rain is pretty much predictable, right? That's why, our burning and disking and different things like that, we can somewhat predict what's going to happen when we do those things. In South Texas, the rain is so unpredictable. Everything is driven by rainfall. To paint that picture for someone that may not be familiar with South Texas and arid and semi-arid environments is there are some years when the rain doesn't come and there's near zero fawn recruitment. Like the fawns just don't make it, right? Your forbs don't come through when the rain doesn't fall. And so, it was really enlightening to see that, deer management and ecology there are more similarities than differences, but it's definitely different in that part of the world. So.
It's a very cool environment. I too am grateful that I was able to spend years down there, did my master's degree down there. And, what it really showed me was the concepts of deer management are all the same.
Yep.
But what they have down there, there's nothing special about Texas deer. But what is very, very special are the landscapes where you can control harvest.
Yeah.
And so when you have these large private properties of 50 to 100,000+ acres, and you can control buck age structure, it just really shows you what you can accomplish. And so I remember my eyes being, opened so much down there of learning that things like when you're born in a different part of the country, and of course back then it was magazines, now it'd be TV shows and social media, but magazine cover with all these Texas deer, these 160s, 170s, 180s, and you start thinking, man, there's just something different about those deer. They just all they just have above average antlers, all of them. And you get down there and you start doing random samples, Jacob, like you did helicopter captures and so forth, and you find out, no, they're not.
Yeah.
They have the exact same Boone and Crockett score for like many places in Mississippi. It's just that they allow buck age structure to get so much older and are only harvesting the very best bucks at maturity. And that's where you get all the magazine covers. So there were a lot of epiphanies for me, when working in that landscape.
Yeah, 100%. And Eric mentioned this earlier up north. And it sounds like all over the country, we're dealing with the same issues, right? If you want larger antlers, one, you've got to let deer grow to get older and express that, that antler potential. And then deer densities and things like that. And, it is reassuring to go all over the country and see that for the most part, deer management is much more similar than it is different. Those concepts, there's something to them, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The fundamentals are the fundamentals.
Absolutely.
And it's all how they're applied at context dependent management. And Bronson, you and I have had quite a run here over 25 years in partnership as research, and you worked with the research, and you let me you dragged me into all this social media and podcast stuff, and I actually listen to a podcast or two now. Thank you for helping me get over that hump. But it was such a great partnership, and here's to some great times that we had, and we had a great time doing it, and we had some impacts. And we're tossing around what we might call this episode, like the passing of the torch was mentioned, and I feel pretty comfortable about passing a torch. The other option was passing the baton.
Yeah.
And if anybody knows me and Bronson, if we were trying to run around a track and pass something while we're actually running, we'd probably fall and hurt ourselves. And so the torch is a better analogy because you can walk. Nobody runs while they're carrying a torch.
Yeah.
It's like that and scissors you don't run with.
No.
So
I'm even concerned you with the torch, you're going to burn yourself.
Yeah, my hair, it could catch my hair on fire very easily.
Exactly.
But
We might even say it like this. We're going to just hand them the keys.
I like that.
Yeah.
They obviously have
safer.
They have keys to our offices now. They're not ours anymore. They're theirs.
They already have the keys. That's right.
Well, we can't say, we can't say enough great things. It's come full circle here, and I'm truly honored to be in this position. I think Eric feels the same. But we're products of the Deer Lab. The beast that y'all have built. We're going to keep that identity. We're going to keep pushing forward and doing good work. And I can't say enough good things about what y'all have done.
Yeah, absolutely. I second all of that. There's no way I'd be in this situation if it wasn't for you two through those years of grad school. So excited to be back. A lot of things we want to do, big shoes to fill, but we're excited.
Yeah. And I don't think I mentioned it, but y'all were both part of my master's research, but also Dr. Damaris, Steve, was my undergrad advisor as well. So we've worked together for many, many years.
And you were a fantastic deer catcher on our Lowndes County buck study.
Yeah. I'd like to think so, at least. Glad you think so.
It's not near as efficient as it is in South Texas, is it, Jacob? Catching deer here. They can do more in one day than it takes us 3 months to capture.
Yeah, we were. I had many days we would catch 100 deer a day because we'd get the helicopters out, right? So instead of the box traps and the drop nets and stuff. So again, that was another different world situation moving to South Texas.
Context dependent.
Yeah.
Well, guys, we are we're very happy y'all wanted to come back and take these jobs. We think y'all are perfect for the situation. Your interests, your research ideas, I really, really admire that both of you always are looking at research ideas and what it's going to mean to the management community. What is it going to mean to hunters, to landowners, to our stakeholders? And I think if you always keep that in mind, that whatever we are researching, that the result can move the needle with deer management, I think you're going to be okay. I think if that is your grounding principle right there, you're always going to be successful.
100%.
And I would add to that, I always got juiced when I'm talking to wildlife biologists, especially deer biologists, and they're paying attention to what we've learned. And then we also, can talk to hunters and landowners, and they're paying attention. If you have both of those audiences listening to what you're saying, you got it covered, buddies.
Yeah, I think so. And it helps that we are those people too, right? We're biologists, but we're also hunters. I mean, that's my number one passion, right? So we want to learn just as much as we can. We want to work with the hunters and landowners. We are working with the hunters and landowners. So yeah, well, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I got my start because I deer hunted. That's
Me too.
why I'm
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Okay, gentlemen. Well, thank y'all so much. Really look forward to seeing what you guys do. And Steve and I are going to also continue to be part of the podcast at some level. So I guess, Steve, you and I will just be guests from this point forward. That'll be kind of weird. But it's also weird us looking at them in our offices too. So I guess that's the new reality, huh?
It's weird sitting on this side of the desk. That's weird.
Yes.
I'm usually sitting over there,
Yeah.
Yep.
It's natural succession.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's right. That's right.
Managed succession. Y'all taking over. Good luck, guys. More power to you.
Yep. Good luck, guys. And
Thank you very
we'll
much.
continue this conversation in the future. So thanks, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowed financial support of our efforts.
We also thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. If you have questions or suggestions, please log on to msudeerlab.com and click on the Deer University tab.